The mainstream ontology of reality, aka the kind of fundamental assumption that we hold whenever we try to discover truths about reality, is that of physicalism. This is the idea that the world is composed of physical units, which we call matter. This is so ingrained in our way of thinking that we don't actually consider the possibility that it's false. Granted, there are good reasons for it to be a kind of fundamental assumption. I think that our brains evolved naturally to assume that there's a physical world out there. But the philosophy of idealism proposes that the world isn't composed of matter at all, but rather of mind. This is actually distinct from the idea that the universe possesses consciousness, also known as panpsychism, which proposes that all of the matter in the universe is conscious. But idealism instead posits that there is no matter in the universe, rather that the universe is literally composed of consciousness. Mind is the substance of the universe. And also by consciousness, I also mean any kind of mental experience, because that's how Bernardo Kastrup uses the word consciousness. And I'm essentially using his arguments outlined in his book, The Idea of the World, in order to kind of make the case for idealism. Because it is a very consistent and surprisingly convincing argument. And it might sound perhaps a bit insane at first to suggest that the universe is a mind. But if you follow this line of reasoning, you might be led to the startling yet still logically consistent conclusion that the universe is akin to an enormous thinking mind. So to understand this position, we will need to understand why physicalism is flawed. Physicalism posits the existence of inanimate units, which are called matter, and these units, arranged in particular ways, can give rise to the phenomenon that we experience as mind. This seems logically sound. I mean, all the objects around you seem physical. When you touch things, they feel solid and real. So naturally, you could conclude that they are composed of matter. But what we often forget is that this assumption is an inference based on the more fundamental fact of experience. You can't directly perceive matter. Our knowledge of matter and the things we know about matter come from our perceptions, and perceptions are themselves mental. So mind actually comes first, and we can't know about matter as confidently as we know about mind. And so the idea of matter is itself an explanatory abstraction derived from mind. As the physicist Andre Linde wrote, "Let us remember that our knowledge of the world begins not with matter, but with perceptions. I know for sure that my pain exists, my green exists, my sweet exists. I do not need any proof of their existence, because these events are a part of me. Everything else is a theory." Later, we find out that our perceptions obey some laws, which can be most conveniently formulated if we assume that there is some underlying reality beyond our perceptions. This model of material world obeying laws of physics is so successful that soon we forget our starting point and say that matter is the only reality, and perceptions are only helpful for its description. So not only is the mind ontologically primary to matter, our theories of matter are just mental creations which we impose on our perceptions to explain the regularities we observe. There are a lot of examples of this, but people don't often realize that the theories we develop of matter are mental creations. For instance, this model of the atom is a mental creation we use to understand the concept of atoms. And you know it's a mental creation because nobody's ever actually seen an atom, so we need to produce models like this. And then these models help us to understand the regularities we observe when we interact with particles. And different models can be generated, again using our minds, to illuminate different aspects of the fundamental nature or the apparent fundamental nature of these observations. But notice that we're always using physics to describe our observations. It's always things that we perceive, aka always mental experiences. But after developing the theory of matter, we often make the mistake of assuming that this is reality rather than the mental creation we use to understand whatever reality actually is. Physicalism is also flawed with respect to the hard problem of consciousness. Even if we assume that matter exists, it seems nearly impossible, and I say it seems nearly impossible because it's possible that this might change in the future, but at the present moment, it seems that there's no way to understand how physically arranging anything can give rise to mind. I mean, we can look at the mind and we can study the brain and we can see what's going on, but it's hard to imagine how any arrangement of matter can produce the experience of mind. The example that I like to use is to think about your own thoughts. What are your thoughts? Like, what are they in a literal sense? Because it's easy to be like, oh, thoughts are just your neurons firing in your brain. But that implies that by just looking at the neurons in somebody's brain, you can know what they're thinking. And does that seem like it makes sense? It doesn't really seem like you're capable of seeing somebody's thoughts just from looking at the matter in their brain. And this hard problem of consciousness basically asserts that it's impossible to imagine how inanimate matter, no matter how it's arranged, can give rise to mind. And it's a hard problem because thus far, nobody's been able to solve it. And we can't just do the thing which physicalists often do, which is to assert that mind doesn't exist. Because mind is the first thing that we know. The existence of mind is self-evident. The existence of matter is an inference we make based on our experiences of mind. So it actually doesn't make sense to say that the mind doesn't exist. Because as far as we can tell, it's the only thing that exists. The main reason we posit the existence of matter is because we seem to perceive the same thing out there. So positing the existence of matter can give us some explanatory power, but it can't explain the very thing that we use to infer its existence. Now, what idealism does is that instead of positing matter, it posits that everything is composed of mind. This doesn't actually make any assumptions and is less presumptuous than the theory of matter, because we can unquestionably posit the existence of mind. So idealism essentially says that the universe is more likely to be composed of something that we do know exists rather than something that we infer. Since mind definitely objectively exists, it makes more sense to suppose that the universe itself is more akin to mind than something we can't be as confident about, aka matter. So positing that the universe is mind is actually more conservative than positing that it is matter. And in fact, it is way easier to explain matter in terms of mind, aka as perceptions, observations, these mental creations that we use, these theories that we develop. We can explain those better as mental creations than we can do the opposite, than explain the mind as a consequence of matter. Even if you think of a particle detector as being proof of matter, as being proof of a world that exists independently of observations, you're coming to this conclusion using your perceptions, aka using your mind. Because again, you need to perceive the instruments that are being used, and you also need to interpret what the instruments are saying. And so the information that you're supposedly reaching about a physical universe only reaches you through the realm of the mind. And some of the greatest physicists in history realized quite quickly that it doesn't make sense to posit that physics is an attempt to model reality. Physics is instead an attempt to model our perceptions of reality. Physics attempts to model the results of observations. We can't actually say what the world is like out there. All we can say is how it appears to our perceptions. As Werner Heisenberg put it, the laws of nature which we formulate mathematically in quantum theory deal no longer with the particles themselves, but with our knowledge of the elementary particles. There's also a flaw in the supposed dichotomy between mind and matter. Positing that mind and matter forms a dichotomy is actually producing a false dichotomy. So saying that the universe is mind is not equivalent or opposite to saying that the universe is matter. True dichotomies need to possess a property which Kastrup calls epistemic symmetry. This means that knowing the status of one member of the dichotomy instantly gives you information about the status of the other member of the dichotomy. So for example, is the dichotomy between dead and alive a true dichotomy? Yes, because if I say that something's not alive, you automatically know that it's dead. What about success and failure? Well, if you establish a criterion for success, not reaching that criterion automatically means failure. Information about one side of the dichotomy gives you information about the other. So does that actually apply to mind and matter? No, because according to Kastrup, they don't exist at the same level of abstraction. Mind is an immediate experience, whereas matter is an assumption we make based on that experience. So, in a sense, it's an abstraction of mental experiences. That's why, for example, love can't be the opposite of water molecules. If I say that something isn't mind, that doesn't necessarily imply that it's matter. Mind is the substrate of the explanatory framework we call matter. So if there are flaws in a physicalist ontology, how can we understand idealism? Idealism posits that all of existence is composed of ideas, thoughts, emotions, perceptions, imaginations, and any other mental phenomena. What we call matter is just how the universal mind looks when other minds perceive it. We are, as these other minds, what Kastrup calls dissociated alters of the universal mind. Basically, if the universe is a mind, our minds have kind of split off from the main mind, but that main mind still influences us and we still influence it. And this interaction gives rise to what we call matter. By dissociated alters, Kastrup is referring to dissociative identity disorder. This is where a person has multiple split personalities, and these split personalities can even have access to different levels of information. I mean, they might not even know about the existence of each other. So what Kastrup is saying is that we're essentially split personalities of a universal mind. Our minds are dissociated from the universal mind. The once unitary experience of a universal mind has broken down into individual dissociated units, each of which is independently capable of having experience. So just to be clear, idealism isn't saying that the universe exists solely within our individual minds, as is suggested by solipsism, because we do live in a shared universe and we do consistently observe the same things. But rather, idealism posits that the universe itself is a thinking mind. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, does that mean that like this desk in front of me is conscious, or like this phone is conscious? According to Kastrup, this isn't actually necessarily the case. Think about it. If you took a single neuron from your brain, does it feel like something to be that neuron? Does that neuron have an individual experience? It's possible, but it doesn't seem like it. So in a similar way, maybe it doesn't feel like something to be an individual desk or an individual phone. Maybe it only feels like something to be the universe as a whole. So while it may not feel like anything to be individual items in the world, it may feel like something to be the universe as a whole. And this seems potentially supported by the fact that the universe on the largest scales does seem to resemble a nervous system. And not just in the way it looks, but like the kind of fine details of its structures. Maybe the large-scale universe actually experiences something. Idealism therefore posits that mind is nature's sole ontological primitive. And by primitive, he means the fundamental substrate of the universe. Because we need to at least start with one thing that's fundamental. In physics, they presume the existence of string, of fundamental particles, or of quantum fields. In idealism, it's posited to be mind. The universe is having some kind of a mental experience. In fact, it is that mental experience. So how do we reconcile this with facts which appear to suggest otherwise? For example, there are correlations between inner experience and brain activity as read by an EEG. That would suggest that something apart from mind gives rise to experience. To understand how idealism makes sense of this, remember that it proposes that the entire universe is mental. So what we view when we read an EEG is not the physical world, but rather how the mental world appears from the perspective of something that has dissociated from it. And this is kind of an interesting idea. The reason you can only encounter mind, because no matter what you look at, you're always experiencing your own mind. The main reason that's true is because everything is mind to begin with. So you can only experience mind because there only is mind. Not necessarily just my mind, but mind in general, the mind of the universe. But not only that, there's a sense in which the mental universe causes our perceptions. What we experience as matter, what we call matter, is actually the interaction between two minds. Physics attempts to model our observations, and when we observe the physical world, what we're actually observing is our own minds. The models we create are just the attempt to understand that, the attempt of one mind to understand another mind. If mind out there is partially responsible for giving rise to mind in here, it should also be the case that different alters of universal mind, aka two distinct people, can cause each other's perceptions. So when I look at the brain scan of another person, it may be easy to conclude that I'm seeing the physical activity of their brain. But according to Kastrup, what we're actually experiencing is quite different. Let's call two people alters 1 A1 and alter 2 A2. And remember, alters are just distinct people with their own mental experiences, or they can even be distinct animals, anything with a dissociated mental experience. You can argue that A2's inner experience causes their brain activity, not the other way around. And when we read a brain scan of A2's mental activity, what we are seeing is A2's mental activity as it appears from A1's perspective. We aren't necessarily seeing the physical stuff that comprises their brain, but instead we're seeing an extrinsic view of something else's mental experience. So when you're looking at a person's brain, you're actually looking at their mind. But their mind just happens to look like that from your perspective. You can't see their actual mind. Perhaps there's some kind of filter, or by being dissociated alters, we don't have full access to the experience of another person. But we can still see the experience of another person when we look at their brain. It just happens to look like that from our perspective, but from their perspective, it looks like a mind, their own minds. So when you look at a cat, according to this theory, you aren't looking at the cat's physical body, because there is no physical body. You're looking at its mental experiences, but it just happens to look like that from your perspective. Because again, your mind produces a coded representation of the universal mind. You can't see all of the mental experiences of a cat, and you can't experience what it's like to be the entire universe at once. All you can do is experience how your mind represents that in a coded format. This also explains why we all inhabit the same universe, because we're all immersed in a universal mind. And since there's only one universal mind, as far as we can tell, it's possible for us to share observations. But what about physically disrupting the brain? There's a lot of ways this can happen, but I'll just focus on one example, that of taking psychoactive chemicals. This again seems to suggest that something physical is affecting the brain and causing a change in mental activity, i.e. it's going from the physical to the mental. That seems to be the arrow of causation. But under this ontology, what we call physically interfering with the brain is actually interference by the mental universe. So remember, when you look at anything, you're looking at the mental universe, and there's a sense in which the character of the mental universe affects your perceptions. So when you take psychoactive chemicals, it could be the case that this is how universal mind influences your mind. In other words, psychoactive drugs are mental components of the world out there, and when we try to observe them using particle detectors or whatever else you use to kind of study molecules, you're just seeing how it appears to you. But these are actually components of the mental universe that influence our minds when they enter our bodies. But this actually explains a lot. Why are molecules capable of affecting our subjective experiences? The theory of matter can't explain that. Again, it's the hard problem of consciousness. But it makes more sense the other way around. The reason molecules can affect our experience is because they themselves are also mental. Particles are aspects of the universal mind, so it's not inconceivable to see how mind can change and affect other minds. For example, your unconscious mind influencing your conscious mind. There are dissociated aspects even within your own mind, and they're capable of influencing each other. So just as your psyche is itself dissociated from other parts of your psyche, you as a totality are dissociated from universal mind. It's like we're the conscious psyche of an unconscious universe. In a way, that's kind of just a metaphor, but hopefully it kind of explains what I'm trying to explain. And again, the theory of matter is just an invention of our minds that we use to make sense of regular observations that we perceive. So what about the laws of nature? Why are they so consistent and regular? This can be explained if we treat the laws of nature as being the archetypes of universal mind, aka fundamental, irreducible elements of universal mind. The regularities we observe as the laws of physics are just the core fundamental elements of how universal mind operates. So what is it that we call the physical world? The physical world is an epiphenomenon. It's what we perceive when we try to look at another mind. Look around you. According to idealism, what you are seeing is what another mind looks when you try to observe it, just as brain scans are how someone else's mind looks when you try to observe it. The entire world is produced by two minds observing and interacting with each other. You can argue that the universal mind attempting to observe itself gives rise to matter, because observation seems fundamental for matter. So does idealism convince you of the mental nature of the universe? I personally don't want to take a stand. I don't want to discard the theory of matter or necessarily reject idealism. I'm trying to be agnostic about this because fundamentally I don't know. But I haven't explained the one thing that I think gives idealism a big edge over physicalism. And that's the fact that a lot of the mysteries in quantum mechanics in modern physics can actually be perfectly well explained if the universe is a mind. Some of the most glaring paradoxes that arise in quantum physics just make perfect sense if the universe is mental. And since that's a very complicated topic and I'm probably gonna suck at explaining it, I've decided to do it in the next video. So if you guys are down, I'll try to explain how quantum mechanics makes perfect sense under an idealist ontology. I'm not an expert or anything, so I'll probably be using other resources to help illuminate what I'm saying, but I personally find it very convincing. And if you do understand quantum physics, I hope that you'll understand why it's also very convincing. But before that, I'd like to invite you all to join us on Patreon, because it would be super helpful for me and it would help me produce better videos for you. And by joining us on Patreon, you get access to our Discord server, where we have a lot of discussions about things like this, and I'm sure that this will definitely come up as a topic of discussion. So if you want to ask me questions directly about this theory and get input from other people, joining us on Discord would be a great way to do that, and you support the channel, and I would love you immensely. Anyways, thanks for watching, have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.